Welcome to GS Podcast number 105. I'm Stephen Knight. Good to have you. Hope you're well. Very pleased to welcome back Ella Whelan to this week's episode. Ella is an author and the assistant editor at Spiked Online, and we're going to be talking mostly about her new book, which is titled What Women Want: Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism. I've read it and it's great. It's a small volume, but it really packs a punch. It really delves into and takes apart some of the really popular and more obnoxious traits of third wave mainstream feminism. So I highly recommend picking that up. I've provided a link to that in the show notes as well. So as well as delving into that, we'll also be touching on the sexual abuse scandals and accusations surrounding, I think, maybe Westminster and a lot of the celebrity classes and various other areas of public life are now being heavily reported on what seems like a daily basis, really. Obviously, sexual assault and rape is a horrendous and real thing, and that's getting a lot of attention. That's not going unreported. That's not being swept under the carpet at the minute, which is a good thing. This podcast in general has always tried to have the alternative conversation in a sense, or not really cover the mainstream talking points. So I suppose this conversation kind of takes a step back and looks at the whole picture and kind of sees where some of these proposed solutions to the problem may lead us and whether they're necessarily a good thing. So we'll be having that conversation on the show. Ella's a tenacious defender of individual liberty. I would suggest putting her name into YouTube and seeing some of the panels and debates she's had on various news outlets and Sunday morning television and things like that. You can find her on Twitter as well at Ella_M_Whelan. Send us some love, send us some feedback, send us some kind words, and consider picking up a copy of her book, What Women Want: Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism. You can keep up to date on this very podcast and find out ways to support the show by visiting gspellchecker.com. Enjoy!
There's a word that some folks find real hard to spell. Ain't it horrible for me, except after seeing who cared to go burn in hell? But then along came a man, a spell took across the God of Creed, and he set out upon a noble quest to help those that don't know what it means. And he said, it goes A-C-H-E-I-S-T, and don't you put that I before that E. A-C-H-E-I-S-T, don't mean we know, speak to W. And he keeps on out, things got this say, a reason shoppers at night will make them run away. But if they start that fight, well, they can go all day. Spell checker, easy, got a spell check. Now you know how it goes, so sing along with me. A-C-H-E-I-S-T, 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 A-C-H-E-I-S-T.
It's a great pleasure to welcome Ella Whelan back to the GS podcast. Ella, how are you?
Very well, thanks for having me.
Excellent. How was your battle of ideas in the great city of Manchester the other week?
Yes, it was great. I haven't been to Manchester for years, so I loved coming up there. And we had a really interesting discussion actually about identity politics, which inevitably turned into a discussion about recent news and Me Too and all that kind of stuff. So it was great, really engaged audience, and we had a bit of a row, which is always good.
Always good, yeah. A little bit feisty. Always makes it entertaining. I really wanted to come along to that, but my family has this really annoying tradition where we buy a shitload of fireworks at that time of year and just set them off on the local field, and to not be there would be to concede, I think. But I was very pleased to see that it sold out as well, so a great turnout. So there's obviously a huge appetite for that kind of debate at the moment.
Yeah, I think so. I think people want to discuss the kind of even if people aren't necessarily deeply political or kind of switched onto it all the time and obsessing about it as I might be, these kind of issues of identity politics, feminism, censorship are coming up so much that I think everybody does have a strong opinion on it, so people want to talk about it.
Great. Well, I really enjoyed reading your latest book. The title is What Women Want: Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism. And something your book makes very clear throughout is that the market's very much saturated with pro-feminist literature. And this one isn't, quite clearly. And maybe before we jump into that, we could talk a little bit about, I suppose we could define our terms. Maybe before we talk about what feminism has become or what it is today, you could maybe say what it stood for, how you would have defined it when it started emerging as this great force for sort of female equality?
Well, I mean, it's important to remember that feminism is a relatively, and I say relatively, new phenomenon in terms of it is not yet really 100 years old yet. I mean, that when we're talking about the suffragettes and people that contemporary feminists often invoke, like my hero Sylvia Pankhurst, never considered herself to be a feminist. It wasn't a word that was used. It wasn't, a feminism wasn't in the dictionary of many of the first kind of brave women who stood up for women's equality and women's rights and freedom. So it's something that then changed into, became a political movement. And I think was very positive in its early kind of, I suppose you could call first wave feminism, in terms of the kind of, arguing for women's freedom to wear what they like, to say what they like, to have sex with who they like, to break out into the public realm, to do things that men could do, to be trusted the same amount as men. And all that came with the very strong assertion that women were equal to men. That meant that women were as strong as men, or could be, and were as tough, and very much kind of chest thumping. Camille Paglia calls it Amazonian feminism, of a I will not be put down any longer. That's what kind of drove feminism in its early kind of years. And it's kind of changed. But second wave feminism became more interested in sexual politics. And then you kind of had third wave feminism, which to me is the kind of death of feminism, which is when it turned into a discussion about protecting women, about the public life being a threat to women, that we need to have protection from words. The anti-porn feminists like Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, who I talk about in the book, it all started to completely shift from the idea that women were tough, ugly, strong, gonna beat you up if you gave them any trouble, to right back, kind of 360 back to the very fragile, very weak, very shy, wallflowerish kind of woman who, needs to be protected, can't deal with the twos and throws in public life, couldn't possibly deal with a kind of ogreish man. Oh, God, no, that was too much to handle. So it's kind of very interesting. And I think what I've tried to do is point this out, because I don't think anyone really has pointed it out, that actually feminism as it stands now has gone 360 back to the sexism of old. And really has nothing in common with the early feminism, the kind of early women's liberation movements of the past.
Okay, so in a sense, feminism, in terms of the number of people who are adhering to it, are dwindling. The figures. It's strange. It's very strange, because most of the women in my life are very strong characters, and the kind of women who I just can't imagine them taking any shit from anyone. But to the suggestion that they're feminist in their ideas, they'd instantly pull their face at the thought of it. It's just this dirty word to them, and that seems to be the feeling of most people, certainly that I know, and the figures certainly reflect that. But one thing you point out in your book is that there's this idea in sort of mainstream media circles, especially in the celebrity class, that you're either, why wouldn't you be a feminist? You're either a feminist or you're ignorant or a misogynist. So why do you think it has such a prominence in our popular culture and public discourse at the moment, yet the general public seem to be very unimpressed with the idea?
Well, I mean, it has become pretty much a label, and that means that only a certain section of society tends to want to wear labels. There has been stuff talked about in terms of, I mentioned in the book, there's people like Hillary Clinton, who, the failed US president, who said that, of course we're all feminists. It's a ridiculous thing to ask, am I a feminist? What a ridiculous question to ask. And there's this kind of assumption that women, if you're not a feminist, then you are a woman hater. There's no kind of in between. You're either part of the club and you wear the badge, or you're out of the gang. And if you're out of the gang, well, then you're the enemy. And and it's kind of gone hand in hand with the commercialization of feminism. So like I was in this sort of trendy shop called Monkey the other day in Carnaby Street in London, and they've got, you know, next to all the sort of saucy underwear, they've got big pink glittery bags which say feminist, and, you know, H&M and Topshop are selling T-shirts that say, you know, I'm a feminist, and Ed Miliband and Harriet Harman famously wore this is what feminist looks like T-shirts.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yes, so I mean that is significant, because feminism has become this thing, this pin that you stick on the back of your bag to signal that you are a part of a certain section of society. In terms of what that's politically worth, well, it's nothing. It's, you know, it's the kind of capitalism feminism. It's got no interest in actually making any political demands. It very much serves to the needs of a certain section of society. So it's the kind of whingy middle class media types. And you're right. The women that I know and have grew up with, and you know, most working class women, it isn't a thing that they identify with. And that's not because they sort of have taken the anti-feminist stance, which is, you know, lots of sort of people have taken now, which is almost just as silly as the kind of, you know, crazy feminist stance. They just think this is the conversation that isn't for me. It's just not, you know, it's got nothing politically to do with my life experience, the kind of hardships I face at work, or the difficulty I have in, you know, feeding my kids, or whatever it is. Feminism doesn't give me anything, doesn't give me any political tools to deal with that. And so, you know, so what? All right, we'll let Caitlin Moran, and we'll let Jessica Valenti, and we'll let, you know, Jess Phillips and all the kind of feminist MPs wax lyrical about it. But I mean, I don't care. And I think what I was trying to get at in the book is that that's, you know, these women who are calling themselves feminists and saying that all women have to be feminists, what they're doing is actively ignoring the fact that they are speaking on behalf of women, when in fact they are such a minority and do not represent either the views, the political views, or the political desires of most women in the country.
I mean, I think you say in the book at some point something along the lines of feminism is sort of like a purist form, or like an ultimate form of identity politics, after you speak a bit about Hillary Clinton. And I suppose you mentioned that she led really on this idea that she's a grandma, she's a woman, the idea of a woman's virtuous, and it just didn't seem to wash well with voters, did it? It seems like, regardless of who the politics are coming from, even someone from Trump who's got sexist ideas, as long as he seems to be putting political ideas forward, that seems to always win out in the race between identity politics.
Yeah, I mean, feminism is the purest form of identity politics because it was the first political movement, really. I mean, there was the gay liberation movement as well, but feminism kind of predated that in being the first political movement which put identity front and center. And that was when the famous feminist slogan, "The personal is political." So it was putting being female at the heart of political campaigns. So you weren't arguing for pro-choice because we believe in bodily autonomy and people's freedom to, you know, live their lives as they want. We're doing it because women, you know, it's a women's issue, and we're not arguing against rape and sexual harassment because, you know, it's wrong, morally wrong to force anyone to do anything that they don't want to. It's because this is all about women. So, you know, while that was kind of understandable at the time, it is, you know, responsible in many ways for setting off the trend of identity politics, for people to see themselves, you know, first and foremost, I am a woman, rather than I am an individual political being. I am a woman, and so my politics get defined by that. And of course, it doesn't work. You know, with Hillary Clinton is the prime example. I think it's so hilarious that she has called her book "What Happened," and then on the bottom section of the book it says Hillary Clinton, because I mean, she doesn't, you know, Hillary and her supporters still don't realize that identity politics in that way, and it wasn't even feminism she was really using. She kind of vaguely touched on feminism to kind of excite some of her celebrity fans, but the idea of like, I am grandma, I'm a woman, and therefore I bring a kinder, gentler politics, you know, I bring a nicer, warmer, fuzzier, safer politics. Well, you know, actually most women are insulted by that, because we fought very hard, you know, and our ancestors fought very hard against the idea that femininity was something that dominated women's experience of the world, and that, you know, not all women were kind of cuddly, pink, lovely grannies types. But, you know, in the world of politics, where reality is what you see and what you experience and what you want, this sort of bullshit idea that, you know, she was speaking on behalf of all women just didn't wash. And I'm very glad it didn't wash. It could have very easily gone the way that so many of the kind of, you know, intelligentsia in the US wanted it to, which is that, you know, the nice lady would win out. And actually, I'm very glad that lots of people in the US gave her the two fingers, because I think it was the start of a realization, hopefully, that, you know, people don't buy into identity politics because it's crass, and people have bigger political aspirations than just being obsessed with gender or race or sexuality.
Okay. I mean, we spoke a little bit about what feminism was and what it's become, and there's always a handful of, I'd say, third wave feminist tropes that crop up all the time, and I thought maybe we could just talk about a couple of them, because you kind of debunk them and take them apart quite well in your book. And I suppose probably one of the largest ones is this idea of a rape culture. We're often told in the West, I've heard it said about Britain, I've heard it said about the United States, that we live in a rape culture. This idea that women are fair game for rape, or it's not being treated seriously, or the media is representing women in a way that's encouraging men to rape and such. And I was wondering, maybe you could explain a little bit why we don't live in a rape culture and where that sort of attitude's coming from, what sort of data's being skewed to get us there.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the most damaging things to have come out of contemporary feminism, I think, and we're seeing the repercussions in all aspects of the, you know, recent panic about sexual harassment and everything. The idea of a rape culture is that because we live in a patriarchal society, supposedly, women live under a rape culture. They live under a society which believes that they are less equal, and so rape is okay. And the way that feminists point to that as evidence is that, you know, they call things rapey. So a man whistling at you on the street is rapey, and a guy asking you out at the bar who, you know, is probably standing a bit too close is symptomatic of rape culture. It's part of the idea that women are constantly under threat because they're women, and that men are constantly a threat because they are these kind of rapacious beasts. You know, they're genuinely, and I can't stress this enough, isn't the evidence to prove that. What there is a redefining of what we consider to be harm, violence, and threat. So when people talk about rape culture, they're actually usually not talking about rape. So they're not talking about rape statistics. They're not talking about an increase in rape, because there hasn't been an increase in rape. In fact, most sensible people will admit to the fact that, you know, sexual assault and rape happens less, because we can remember and look back at history and see what a rough time women actually had in the 40s and 50s, those of them who were breaking out into the public realm when there was real sexism. That is lessened now, and women lead much freer and better lives because of the victories of our, you know, of past women who have fought back for freedom. What they're talking about is not rape. What they're talking about is sexual behavior of a sort of varying deviant kind. So yes, wolf whistling, or catcalling, or suggestive comments and jokes, and, you know, looks and glances, and perhaps even people copping a feel. And so you have this conflation of bad behavior, let's call it, because, you know, who wants to be groped or catcalled? That's freaking annoying. No, you know, it's not saying that it's a great thing, but it certainly isn't sexual harassment or rape. And so you then have this idea that on the basis that, you know, a few women get catcalled, which, I mean, it really doesn't happen that often anymore. Even a difference from when I was a teenager to now, it really doesn't happen that often anymore. But you get those kind of anecdotes used as evidence that we live in a rape culture. And what are the consequences? The consequences are that it's, you know, statistically shown, studies have shown that people are having less sex, that women going to universities especially are nervous about being raped on their campus. The fear-mongering is having an effect, that people are feeling more cautious about interactions between the sexes. That's terrible. You've gone from the kind of sexual revolution in the 60s, where people said you should be able to be free to shag whoever you like, and damn the consequences, because this is what freedom is about. And while that had its difficulties, wasn't that a kind of great idea? And now in 2017, we're at a situation in which we're telling especially young women, be afraid of every sexual interaction you have. Be afraid of every man, because what if he turned out to be a rapist, rather than saying, actually, the chances are that you won't have a negative experience, and isn't that a brilliant thing?
Yes, I suppose this really ties into what we're seeing in the zeitgeist at the minute. The thing that's probably getting more news inches and more of our media time is this, since it's kicked off from the Weinstein scandal. And I think we can safely say that case is particularly horrific, and it's good that it's come to light, although I don't think he's been charged with anything just yet, but it does seem incredibly damning. And from there, it seems to be a new story every week about these varying levels of transgressions, from inappropriate comments to, at the top end, rape accusations. So what do you think's going on here? Are we in a situation now where women are just feeling empowered to speak out and finally say what they've been scared to say, or is there a bit of a moral panic about the whole thing? Where do you stand on this issue?
I understand the argument that this is empowering, and I don't think anybody with an ounce of decency in them will feel much sympathy for Harvey Weinstein. He's quite certainly, whether or not he's a rapist is, the case has not been solved there. That's certainly not a question that's been answered. But in terms of, is he a creepy, horrible bastard who, should be kicked in the street by anyone passing by? Yeah. We can definitely say that, he is not a nice person, and he deserves a lot of bad stuff coming his way. Perhaps not criminal, but, I'd certainly spit on the street if I walked past him. But I don't think that this has been an empowering expose for women. I actually think that the Weinstein expose and the fallout from that, and yes, the moral panic that has ensued, has done much more damage than good. And that's not to say that I think women shouldn't come forward. I think that if you have something that you want to say, you should be allowed to say it. Certainly if it's something criminal, you should go to the police. There were questions in my mind about, all these celebrities who knew about this for years, and why didn't any of you say anything about it? That's a kind of open question. But what has happened is there's been this kind of really ugly, grasping sort of scrambling for attention, I think. And this is going to make me sound really unsympathetic and horrible, but I kind of don't care, because I think what has happened is that you have these women coming forward with memories from 20 years ago of someone standing too close to them in a lift, and they get applauded. They get told they're brave. They get told that, they're heroes and, heroines for women, and that they should be sort of celebrated. What are we celebrating? We're celebrating the fact that a dirty old guy once stood too close to you in a lift. What has that got to do with you? What has that got to do with anything you've achieved? Does that make you brave? Certainly you shouldn't be shamed for it. It's something that happened to you that you didn't want to happen. It's bad. We should condemn it, but celebrate it. We get talking about this being a watershed moment for women coming forward. No, it's not. If you look back, actually, there's been campaigns for the, expose of sexual harassment for years. There was Yes All Women, which was about sexual harassment, a hashtag that went around in 2014. Back in 2012, the Everyday Sexism Project set up. Back in 2010, there was the Holler Back campaign, which was about shouting back at street harassment. These campaigns, these watershed moments, we've had about 10 watershed moments in the last decade. So this isn't about breaking new ground in defeating sexual harassment and standing up for women's empowerment. It's the continual slog of victim politics, and it's the continual attempts by feminists to portray women as victims. It actually kind of sickens me. I feel grossed out by the whole thing because I genuinely don't see anything positive in it coming from women. Because, if you look at what's being suggested is not to say, right, when men do bad things, we're going to kind of, punch them in the balls or tell them it's not right or stand up to them and fight back. None of that's being said. What's being said is we have to be protected from men. We have to take preventative measures. We have to put in policies which polices interaction between the sexes. So there's nothing, positive about this scandal. There is only kind of wallowing in victimhood is what I've called it. And that sounds extremely harsh, but I genuinely think that if you've had a negative experience, you should not feel ashamed about it. You should not feel silenced about it. But you should also not let it define your life. And I think that what we're doing here is defining women by their negative experiences, defining them as victims. And, that to me is the anathema of any kind of thing in relation to women's liberation.
Yeah, I mean, could it be a possibility as well, that your personality type is better suited to these sort of interactions and transgressions to us? And I mean, I saw you on TV a couple of weeks back, and I can't remember the exact point, but you were very you eloquently put, but I think it went over a few people's heads. You were saying there's no right or wrong way to, in terms of your personality, how you respond to these kind of things, but you personally wouldn't allow yourself to be harassed in that way. And everybody else in the room seemed to lose it at that moment with you there. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you meant in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really depressed about the reaction that I got to that, because we were talking about the Pestminster scandal and Harvey Weinstein, and I said, I'm a woman that no one's going to try anything on with. That's who I am because of the way that I not just sexual stuff, I don't get pushed around. And that's just because I'm a bit of a bully. That's admittedly the kind of person that I am. I have a hard neck. I'm tough. And that's not just got given to me. That's through my experiences. I have toughened myself. And I was met with utter horror, how dare you say that? How dare you define yourself as a strong woman? Because implicitly in doing that, you are victim shaming. And of course, I am doing nothing of the sort. The idea that, if a shy woman gets sexually harassed or raped, that you would say, oh, well, you didn't put up a good enough fight, so it's your fault. I mean, what kind of monster would say that? That's absolutely not what's at stake here. But I think what we should be doing, and what I feel very strongly that we should be doing, is telling women that actually it's much better to be, not a wallflower, but to, as far as you possibly can, stand up for yourself, never take bad behavior, always have your principles and kind of, put your strong face forward. And my ideal is that, or in situations in which you do have, different personalities and people who aren't able to put up with stuff, or, different strokes for different folks. One day I might be cock of the walk and be able to take any guy on. The next day I might be having a really rough day, and actually someone kind of shoving past me on the tube might make my eyes water. We're human beings. It's different all the time. But we should have a political structure and a women's liberation movement that politically says, actually, no, we are tough. We're not wallflowers. We don't need your help, and we're going to deal with this ourselves. I think the fact that it's become controversial to say I'm a no shit woman is depressing as hell. I mean, this is what people forget. This is how we got here. We didn't get here by the government giving us equality laws. We didn't get here by, one day men just saying, do you know what, actually, I reckon that you probably shouldn't be doing all the cooking. Maybe let's share it. That's not how history happened. Women won their freedom by making political arguments and by saying, I will not be walked on anymore. It was a battle for freedom. That's what I think feminists forget. It was a war. It was a battle. People argued for their right. Women argued for their right as equal citizens. And some of those battles were ugly. And the only way they were won was by strong women standing up and not taking crap anymore. I mean, and what, we're supposed to not do that anymore? I always say that women have it pretty good, and I think we do, but there is still arguments to be had. There is still freedoms to be won, and they are never going to be won, and women are never going to be truly free if we adopt this kind of cringing, whinging, victim-y little girl pose and, you know, shy away from the idea that what is wrong with being a tough ball breaker. Not everyone is going to be that, and not everyone should be that. But I think a little bit more encouragement for people to be, you know, hard-necked and tough. Not just women, men as well. If we all kind of got a bit more robust, I think it would do politics the world of good.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose men there's already a sort of social shaming aspect in that sense. You know, there's the phrase "man up," and I don't know if there's a female equivalent, but it doesn't seem like it's a social requirement in that sense. There are things where if I thought, you know, as a man didn't step up to in public or didn't do, I'd be thought less of by within my peer group, and it just seems like feminism's the opposite direction, and it wants to almost enforce a victimhood mentality on women.
Yeah, I mean, the femininity, the idea that women are by nature sort of softer, kinder, more motherly, more nurturing, you know, that we are calmer, that we are less confrontational. These are all, you know, that some of them may be true for different people, but they were certainly all in the past used as stereotypes, of negative stereotypes of women. They were used as reasons why women shouldn't be allowed to do certain things. So because women were delicate and fragile and sort of, you know, white gloves and sensitive kind of beings, well, of course they couldn't be in the same room as men when they were talking politics. They'd have to leave after dinner and go and play cards or something. You know, that was a stereotype that was used to hold women back. Of course, women couldn't go and be in the workplace because, you know, men would obviously grab them because they would be too much of a distraction, and their womanly ways and not being hard enough to deal with business deals would obviously mean that they couldn't be a CEO. You know, this is stuff that held women back. And now we're kind of saying that there is a virtue in celebrating things. There is nothing wrong with femininity. I'm a hard ass, but I do have my girly moments sometimes. And there is nothing wrong with any of that. But to make it central to a political campaign, to say that feminism is, you know, celebrating victimhood, that feminism is celebrating femininity in this very quiet, shy, please can I kind of way, you know, that has no scope for any kind of political future. That is just simply regressive. It's going back to the Victorian idea of women as sort of creeping, shy, second-class citizens. And, you know, genuinely that absolutely fills me with horror, and I think it fills most women with horror that anyone would think that's what we're like, because the majority of us are not like that.
I think I've just sussed the new title for your next book, Ella Whelan's Girly Moments. What do you think? Well, you mention a lot in your book about this idea of consent and sort of redefining the rules regarding sexual encounters, and that's something that's an even bigger topic since the release of your book because of what we're seeing in the fallout from the Westminster scandal and Weinstein. And yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about that, how we're redefining the rules of what consent is, or where it has to be obtained, in what way, and how that's really sort of stifling any sort of romance.
Yeah, I'm really worried about this. I'm really, really worried. I think that the whole politicization of sex has gone in a really negative way. So instead of freeing ourselves up for sexual interaction, instead of kind of you know, breaking taboos about when and where we can have sex and who with, and freeing up that whole aspect of social life, we've actually kind of brought in more rules. So you have this incredible situation now where, you know, Caroline Lucas, Green Party MP, suggested that all MPs, you know, of which are adult, most of which are over, you know, 20 or 25, are put through lessons to teach them how not to rape. That is what a consent class is. If you're teaching someone how to consent and how to elicit consent, you are teaching them about how not to rape and how not to be raped. I mean, there's no cut the bullshit. That's what it is. And so what you're then saying is that we have a, you know, House of Commons full of people who don't know that they've been, that full of men who have been raping people all along and don't know it. Of course, that is not true. This is something that's happening at universities as well in terms of mandatory consent classes. You have people calling for sex education and consent classes, for kids as young as 4. As young as 4, yeah. I mean, mandatory PHSE classes going into nursery school kids and talking about, when it is and isn't right to hold your friend's hand and all of this kind of stuff. We're genuinely teaching. I'm so worried about this, that we're teaching young people to see sex as a danger to be kind of maneuvered around rather than a potential thing to be enjoyed. I mean, I'm, 26 now. I was, very free in my teenage life, perhaps too free in terms of getting myself in sometimes hairy situations. And I took it all on the chin. And luckily I was kind of, part of a generation that was before all of this sort of panic. Even it's kind of it's a very contemporary thing. It's happened very quickly. And I can assure you that my experiences with, my friends and boys, you made mistakes along the line, but it was all part of learning. It was all part of learning how to be a social being. The same time that you learned that actually you probably shouldn't shout over your friend when you're talking because that was rude. You also learned that, boys learned that you kind of had to wait for the wink before you went in for the kiss. I mean, all of this has happened for years. How has human society progressed? Why aren't we all sort of savages? Why are men no longer sort of the stereotypical caveman knocking the woman on the head with the club and dragging her into the bedroom? I mean, none of that happens anymore, or it very rarely happens, because we are civilized people, because we live in a civilized society, certainly in, the UK, where we have social norms which protect against bad behavior. There's this kind of crazy idea that somebody who rapes just doesn't know, didn't really understand consent. No, a rapist doesn't care about consent. That is the point. A rapist is having a sex with you and assaulting you despite your denial of consent. They don't care whether you say yes or no. That's what makes it such a terrible, horrific crime. So what's the end point? You have a totally dystopian view of sex. You have a totally dystopian view of people. I mean, what's happening in Westminster at the moment in terms of, the rewriting of history, basically, and the kind of dragging up tiny incidences and investigating people for it. It is like a sexual Salem. It is a witch hunt. And what we're doing in the process is judging sex. So the only type of sex that is good and moral and right is that which, you go on 3 dates beforehand, you sign a piece of paper that says we both consent, you exchange X amount of text messages, for legal proof that you both are consenting. And then at some point you have a conversation and say, yes, I want to do this. Yes, I want to do this. Okay, let's engage. I mean, Christ, isn't that romantic?
Yeah, we're almost back to no sex before marriage at this point, aren't we?
I think it is. It has the touch of that. It definitely has a Mary Whitehouse style fear of sex about it. I think most of us, if we're being honest, have either had someone pounce on us when we didn't want to, or have gone in for the kill ourselves, with and been rebuffed or something like that. Romance, which I'm a firm believer in, I'm a horrendous romantic at heart, and I love films when they kind of go in for the kiss and they grab each other and it's all part of the passion of the moment. That's real. That is part of the spice of life. And sometimes it goes wrong. And when it goes wrong in a very innocent kind of way, when someone is trying, not trying to maliciously hurt you, harass you, or rape you, but when someone misjudges a, situation, which happens because we're human beings and all of that, we need to kind of express the fact that you will get over this. So like if you're a 14-year-old girl, young, very young, and your very young boyfriend, as teenagers have young boyfriends, decides to kiss you before you want to kiss him, you tell him that's wrong, but you'll live. It's okay. It's just a kiss. We have this kind of view that young people are just going to kind of expire and die if they have a negative experience. I remember my first kiss. It was awful. Actually, I think I cried after it. It was that bad. It was disgusting. But I mean, I got over it. And, and it's part of being young. I'm really, really, really worried about what young people the kind of view young people have of sex now. I think they're genuinely scared of it, and that is really depressing.
I think my first kiss was spin the bottle, so it was almost contracted in that sense. So I think I kind of passed today's test. You talk a lot about the gender pay gap in your book, and that's always something I've always struggled to grapple with in terms of what figures I'm being fed and in what way they're coming to me. And we've recently had this big expose on our British broadcaster, showing that the female counterparts don't tend to earn as much as the male counterparts, and I think BBC are looking to address that. But a lot of the data is not as it would seem on this issue, and you tend to side with the fact that there isn't actually a gender pay gap, certainly in the UK.
No, there isn't. I mean, that's like saying, there is no God in the 15th century. There isn't a gender pay gap. And what I mean by that is that it is illegal to pay women less than men. That is illegal for like work. It doesn't happen. It would make no sense for it to happen, because why would employers employ men if they could employ women doing the same work for cheaper? What does happen is that data gets taken from different jobs with things like, talent. So, for example, people who are paid on the basis of their talent, like in the TV and entertainment industry, and hours are conflated, and you get unequal comparisons between work. And so you get these kind of crazy stats. And just to take a bit from the book, one of the things that I just found so funny when I was researching this is just take a listen to this. This is the kind of stats that you get. So in March 2015, on International Women's Day, the UN reported that it would take 70 years for the pay gap to close. That was in March 2015. Skip forward to November 2015, and the World Economic Forum said that it would take 118 years for the gender pay gap to close. So that's 70 to 18 years in the matter of months. And then the next year, in November 2016, The Guardian reported from the UK Fawcett Society that the pay gap would take 60 years to close. So you've gone from, in the space of just over a year, the pay gap is 70 years, and then it's 118 years, and then it's back down to 60 years. So, I mean, they don't even know what they're talking about. Stats are genuinely just flying about this. There is one interesting thing that I would like to tackle with, because this conversation is so ludicrous and so kind of, genuinely crazy at times, that people seem to think that the pay gap is this sacred cow that you can't talk about or criticize. There is a thing that's wrong, that women face difficulties in relation to work, and that's the pay gap after they've had children. So, and that's not necessarily to do with the discrimination against mothers. It's the fact that we don't have good childcare facilities in this country. And so women are usually the ones who stay home and look after the kids, rightly or wrongly. And so they get left out of the job market. So there is an interesting conversation there to be had about what factors are determining the fact that women going back to work after kids are, more likely than not going to be on a lesser footing than men. Not a pay gap in terms of like for like work, because again, that's illegal. But women who come back to work after being mothers do struggle to get back into the swing of things, and that's to do with childcare facilities. So you can't have these kind of nuanced and very important conversations, because you've got media people and journalists screaming pay gap. We need to kind of cut the crap on this and say, no, there isn't a gender pay gap. Women, it isn't the patriarchy. Women aren't discriminated against on the basis of their gender. But there is an interesting dynamic that still remains in society, which means that women are still, on the whole, seen as the ones who will take the kids to the doctors, or, yes, be the stay-at-home mum, or pick up the slack with the housework. And so there is a still remaining gender imbalance, but it isn't as simple, and it's far more complex than just saying bosses pay women less, because that isn't the truth. It's more complex than that. And it's actually more based on, the thing that I always say is, I don't care that Chris Evans got 3 point whatever million it was, and that a female BBC journalist got, 2 point whatever million. Who cares about that? What, which of us is going to get our knickers in a twist about that? They're all getting millions, for Christ's sake. What I care about is that, you've got journalists, for example, in top media companies like the BBC, getting X amount of money for doing X amount of hours. And then you've got the, women and men cleaning the BBC who are doing the same amount of hours, much harder work, getting pittance. That's not a gender question there. That's a class question. That's a question of criticism of capitalism. Why don't we want to have that discussion? Well, because it's far more simple and clean to say, oh, the patriarchy discriminates against women. And it's crap. It's bullshit.
Two questions. I think my second one will be about class, because I think that comes up quite a lot in your writing, which I find really, really interesting. I suppose the first question is, what is this mythical beast, the patriarchy, and where can I find it?
I mean, I used to laugh at it, and I think that it's largely fallen out of fashion, thankfully, to talk about the patriarchy. Is something that very much was discussed when I was at university. It's the idea, it's a kind of quite a well-founded idea in lots of sort of feminist theory in relation to feminists in the kind of 80s and 90s who talked about the fact that society is organized around men. So in fact, the great evil and the great kind of battle to be won is not against capitalism, because you're in a post USSR political climate in which criticisms of capitalism or any discussion about communism is very much frowned upon or too difficult to deal with. The big battle now is no longer with that, or no longer about class. All the minors have been defeated, etc., etc. It's what's the great evil? It's men. It's the patriarchy, and it's the fact that men rule the world and organize society around their interests. Now, that isn't true. It's not a male conspiracy. If only it were that easy, actually. It's really, I think, lazy on behalf of feminists to argue that everything that's wrong with society and everything that's holding them back is simply a kind of cohort of bald, paunchy men in some office board somewhere kind of giggling and laughing at the fact that they're tying up all of society's resources. I mean, it's just not true. It's not true in any sense. And the very clear example you can give is that that men do not all men have it better than women, is that you take two people living on an estate down in Tottenham in London, or any kind of, semi-rundown part of the country, and the man and a woman living in that estate will more likely than not have far more in common in terms of their lived experience and their political desires than a woman living down there and, someone living up in Surrey or in a nice posh house in Islington. And that is because we hear that the patriarchy is the way that the world is defined and that society is defined, completely negates the idea of class. It completely ignores social inequality. It completely ignores any question about, the way that society is divided up in terms of resources. It's absolutely lazy and fantastical. And it's a way, I think, of middle-class feminists to not have to talk about the remaining tough and messy issues of class today.
Talking about the remaining tough and messy issues, in your article on Spiked about the Westminster sex abuse allegation, shall we say, you kind of draw a parallel to that and the coverage received in the media to sort of the what's been dubbed Muslim grooming gang, men of Pakistani origin preying on young working class, often troubled girls, and these scandals were widespread, lots uncovered, but you kind of say there's a disparity there between the media attention afforded to that and what's going on in Westminster, and you sort of poke the finger at class as the differentiator there. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, everyone was talking about the scandal of Westminster, the scandal of sexual harassment. And actually, I thought the first thing that came to my mind when all of this kicked off was, well, the real scandal is that you have a middle-class columnist having her knee touched, and the media goes insane about it and talks about it for 2 weeks straight. And it grabs the headlines, and people are debating about the crisis of it. And, the MP in question, Michael Fallon, loses his role. He's being investigated. That all happens on the basis of a knee being touched. In the same paper, that was a column in the Times, in the same paper, a writer, years ago wrote about the fact that there's possibly a cover-up of the continual rape and abuse of young working class girls in care in the North, and it is largely ignored. And what that says to me is that the fact that there was obviously media attention for the cases in Rotherham, Rochdale and Newcastle, and that area, but not on the scale and not on the same, panic that has happened after Westminster. Just a caveat, there is nothing great in judging an event by media reaction, because the media is fickle. It chooses what it wants to panic about. It's not representative of society. Yeah. So, weighting something on the basis of media response is not helpful most of the time. And neither is the sort of low-level bad behaviour of a few MPs comparable with the routine abuse and rape of young girls in care. Having said that, it is important to note the difference in reaction, and it is important to note that actually these, working class white girls were largely ignored. We've had documentaries come out about it, the Betrayed Girls and I think it was what it was called. They were overlooked by the state. They were absolutely left genuinely vulnerable. Vulnerable is a word that gets chucked around so much. These young girls and young women were genuinely vulnerable. They were being drugged. They were, in care. They had no one to look out for them. Social services were failing them. And, no one wants to talk about that. It's too difficult to talk about that, not least because of the fact of the race question, because some of the men were of Pakistani origin. And that allegedly meant that some of the police in the area didn't want to touch it with a barge pole. But I think more because, these were working class girls in sort of, stereotypically run down areas of the country where, no one really cares about what happens to them. But someone who's got social capital, like Kate Maltby or like Jane Garrick, or these kind of columnists and these political aspirational, researchers in the Houses of Parliament who know how to pull a headline, who know how to kind of grab a few column inches, that just, it doesn't sit right with me. And I think most people it doesn't sit right with, because what it is if you know the right people and you know how to get on, then you can get attention. And if you're a, working class girl in care in, Newcastle or some kind of rundown area of Rotherham, well, then you're screwed, because no one's going to listen to you. Why aren't we talking about that? I don't care that Kate Maltby had her knee touched. I couldn't care less. Nobody cares about that. And genuinely nobody cares about that. It is so insignificant. It's nothing. I'm disgusted that it has had so much media attention. Genuinely disgusted. And what makes me more disgusted is that all these things are being talked about in relation to a few flipping pervy MPs. And you have genuine issues, in terms of the people being raped and stuff like that, and that's got nothing. Just as a really quick example, I don't want to make it out like rape is happening all the time, because it isn't. And the cases in the North in Rotherham and Rochdale were specifically horrendous and isolated. But it just struck me that there was a terrible, horrendous case happened just around the same time as the Westminster stuff came out. A girl near me in Bethnal Green was raped 3 times on her way home. 3 times. That's unbelievably horrendous and tragic, by 3 different guys. And it got a kind of a headline in the Evening Standard or something. And then, not saying that we need to be talking about it for weeks. It's just a terrible case of somebody who did something, 3 men who did something terrible. And someone gets their knee touched, and it's the headline for weeks. I mean, what is that about? There's something sick going on there. And I think what's going on there is that, the women who are getting these scandals brought to light in terms of having, been asked to buy sex toys or whatever it is in terms of Westminster scandal, are of a certain class, and the rest of us are not. And so what we have to listen to their kind of rubbish about being threatened by MPs, I don't buy it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of feminist tropes which we've been through, sort of the patriarchy and the gender pay gap, and there's also quite a few anti-feminist tropes. So the common one will be that feminists won't go after Islam, which is quite a patriarchal system, whichever way you spin it. But that's one of these anti-feminist tropes that I personally can't shake. I'm quite a big admirer of someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and the way that she's sort of shunned by mainstream feminism is quite telling to me. I mean, she goes after things like, honour killings, the idea of female modesty within conservative religions, female genital mutilation, things like that, all things that occur in the UK as well. And these are like deadly serious things that go on, yet the feminist outrage surrounding them things seems almost non-existent to me.
Well, I used to be cautious about the kind of trend among some contemporary feminists to really bash Islam. And there was some kind of feminists who I used to go head to head on who only wanted to talk about the fact that, Islam or, extreme versions of Islam really denigrated women and put women's freedom in danger. And of course, that is true in certain cases. Obviously, not all Muslims are wanting to put women in a lesser position to men. That just isn't reality. It's not what most people believe. Most people are far more enlightened than that. But obviously there are, in terms of the problem we have now with Islamism and extreme Islam and terrorism and all that kind of stuff, that question needs to be answered about freedom and what we believe in and liberty. So I've become much more open to talking about it, not because I think we have a huge problem with FGM, not because I think we have a huge problem with honour killings necessarily, although obviously they do happen. It's in rare occasions, thankfully. What I'm more interested in is, looking at what we understand to be what we want from an argument for women's freedom. Is that, the case that we want to kind of bash religion? I don't think so. I think we can accommodate people's beliefs as well as standing up for a common belief that we share in society. I think what we're sorely lacking is a discussion about values, and that might sound old-fashioned, but we kind of shared values is something I'm very interested in kind of talking about, that we should all sign up to the idea of democracy, freedom, liberty, free speech, these kind of cornerstones of society that I think we're kind of losing, and that we're very uncomfortable with saying that we all should stand up for certain values because that wouldn't be being diverse and inclusive or whatever. I'm much more interested in talking about that and saying, and being open to genuinely being critical. If somebody says, I don't, my religion or my whatever it is, my belief system says that I don't think that women should be equal to men or as free as men or whatever, well, then we have to be open to criticize that. I don't think it's a unique problem with extreme Islam. I don't think that the only thing holding women back, certainly in this country, is a threat of that kind. That's kind of fictitious. But we do need to have an honest conversation about what we want from society, what women want from society. That's why I called the book What Women Want. We need to look at what it is that we want and argue for that. And I think what most people want is a kind of shared identity to hold on to, and that being, a belief in freedom and democracy and liberty, something that we can put at the cornerstone of our politics and argue for.
I was going to ask you as well, last time we spoke, we talked a lot about online abuse and the sort of overreaching responses to that in terms of banning people and censorship, and specifically when it came to Twitter. And it's just been reported, I think today, that the blue tick verification that's given to prominent and notable figures is being removed from sort of notorious far-right individuals or people who've been described as such. We're talking Tommy Robinson, Richard Spencer. They've had their blue tick credentials stripped today. Now, my first, I suppose, have you read about this, and do you give a shit?
It's kind of hard to care because I think if you're going to get your knickers in a twist about Twitter tick, you don't have much else on. Yes, really. There's better things to be arguing about. But okay, let's look at it seriously and say, what does this mean? It means that social media companies are making political judgments and making value judgments on the basis of people's politics, and obviously that concerns me because that is what is at the heart of many calls for censorship, certainly in the West, the idea that we should patrol hate speech, that we should police online interactions, that social media companies, there's always this thing, social media companies need to do more to protect minorities, women, vulnerable people in society. And that always finds its expression in things like, whether it be very small, sort of pathetic things like taking away people's Twitter verification status, or right up to quite serious things like blocking people from messaging, taking people away from social media, restricting their free speech. So obviously it's all part and parcel of that. And, why that is not a good thing is because you should always battle bad speech with good speech. So there is absolutely nothing that Tommy Robinson says that I agree with. Most people find him at this point kind of a bit farcical, but I think that he should have the right to say whatever he likes. It's the same with the notorious Milo Yiannopoulos, who's kind of fallen into obscurity now that his Twitter has been taken away. But he said, feminism is cancer, which is the most infantile, stupid thing to ever say. But he should be allowed to say it, because the point is, in allowing him to say it, you allow everyone else, the vast majority of the rest of the world, to say you are an imbecile. And, nobody holds any weight by what you say, because what you're saying is ridiculous. That's what free speech does. It allows bad ideas to be shouted down in the public realm. That is how politics progress. That's how you know what you stand for, because you can say, I stand for this and I don't stand for that. And if we kind of silence all the bad ideas, then it absolutely just takes away from, the richness and the progressive nature, the truly progressive nature of politics.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think they've opened a whole can of worms with this, actually, because the concern was there were a lot of people angry that notorious white supremacist had been blue ticked and identified, and Twitter said something along the lines of our current system gives the impression that this is more than just identification tick. It sort of indicates that we approve of what they say, so we're going to look into it and tweak the way we go about this process. And now it seems the tweaking that they've done is just to come out and remove the confusion by saying, yes, actually we are going to use this system now to say which political opinions we approve or not. And I think in the long run, I think that's going to lead to a lot more reports of every time a blue ticked account say something slightly off colour or a little bit offensive or controversial. I think it's going to increase the amount of reports they have to deal with tenfold. Yeah, definitely. I just think that it would be far more favourable to know that this is Richard Spencer, to know that this is, whatever figure it is that you don't like. This is the verified person. This is them. So if I tweet them saying, you are a dick. Yeah, I'm sending it to the right person. I mean, it's kind of, that is really silly. And I get it, because, the title of the book is What Women Want, Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism. And so I do get a lot of kind of semi-crazy men's rights activists, so-called anti-feminists, so-called alt-righters saying, women need to stay in their place, and thank God someone's saying it, because men and women are biologically different, and that means that, we are different in society, and all this rubbish. That's, and I have quite a difficult time actually saying, no, what I mean by an end to feminism is the victory of women's liberation and an end to this particular strain of creepy, crawly contemporary feminism. So it's quite a nuanced point that takes discussion to come out. And it's a very controversial point. I do get called a rape apologist because I criticize rape culture. I do get called a misogynist because I criticize the idea that every woman should be obliged to be a feminist. Twitter is a horrendous, and social media is a horrendous world of that lacks nuance. Obviously we've now gone up to 280 characters on Twitter, which doesn't particularly help the fact that, myself included, the things that I tweet are not my most politically sound moments. The things that we kind of have knee-jerk reactions to are not our most considered, and sometimes not our most intellectual ones. That doesn't make them invalid.
But it's saying that, in order to use these platforms, these tools, social media is a tool, in order to use it properly, you need to have the freedom to use it completely. And so any kind of idea that you should censor certain things on the basis of protecting the safe world that is social media is just completely anathema. It's not what people want. People want they have in, face-to-face in real life, as they say, IRL. The freedom to say what they think, that should apply online as well. I don't see why it's different.
Okay, Ella, I've really enjoyed speaking to you, and I really did enjoy your book. It just seems to, tick all the things off, all the big topics surrounding feminism at the moment in like a really concise way. Is there anything at all you wanted to get in before I let you get back to your evening?
I just would like to say that I think that this very short polemic, really, what I was trying to do with it is to say what I think most women, certainly, and men, but yeah, mostly what most women are thinking, which is that this particular strain of contemporary feminism, this moment right now, which is, characterized by victim politics, by a very sort of middle class sorority style feminism, does not apply to us. And I think even though it sounds controversial and the book poses as something that's controversial, in fact, what I'm saying is completely normal. It's something that women have believed for a long time, that we are strong and tough and ugly enough to deal with the public realm, to deal with men, to deal with whatever life throws at us. And, what I'm trying to say is the fact that saying that has become controversial is the problem. We need to get back to, what we really believe, back to what we really mean by women's liberation, and kind of push this completely sort of infantile and damaging notion of contemporary feminism being the kind of badge that we all have to wear to one side, and get serious about politics.
Now I'm confused. Now I want to be a feminist after that. I don't know where I stand anymore. Ella, thank you very much for giving up your time to come and speak to me again. I always enjoy speaking to you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. It's great to be on. And I'm really glad you love the book and everything. And I really like your podcast, so I'm very happy to be on.
Thank you for listening to the Godless Spell Checker podcast. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please consider supporting by visiting gspellchecker.com/support. From here, you can either become a Patreon subscriber, or you can give a one-off donation through PayPal, or you can just follow some instructions on how best to share the podcast on social media, put it on a memory stick, throw it at people, whatever works best. Any support's greatly appreciated. I think we've all learned something here today.